Let's go ahead and get started. Welcome everyone to the NEMSIS V3 implementation call. Today is July 8th, 2020. We appreciate you being here with us today. We look forward to a great conversation, several topics on the agenda today. Just as a reminder, these meetings are recorded, so if you ever need to go back in, review a topic, or if you miss a meeting and would like to catch up, they are posted to our website and also to our YouTube channel. Please feel free to chime in when you have a question or a comment. You may do so by unmuting your microphone or by using the chat feature. We're happy to have you do either one of those. Let's get down to the agenda for today. We'll go ahead and start off this morning with Laurel. Laurel, would you like to take that on?
Sure. So I'm just going to talk really briefly about the maintenance that will be going on at the NEMSIS TAC on July 14th and 15th. So I don't think I need to share my screen. I'll just read this off. We've already talked about this once, and there was an email that went out a few weeks ago, but during the July maintenance window, we're going to be disabling TLS 1.1 on all NEMSIS TAC web services. So if you are using TLS 1.1, you have about 1 week to move to TLS 1.2. We're also going to discontinue our old validator and compliance web services. So we released new services for these several months ago, and you'll want to just double check and make sure that if you're sending files that you're sending them to the new services, because if you send them to the old services, they will be rejected because they will no longer exist after next week. If anyone has any questions about maintenance or concerns, feel free to send me an email or anyone on our team, and we'll get back to you as soon as we can. Does anyone have any questions on the call right now about maintenance? Excellent. Okay, well, I'm going to go ahead and pass it off to Clay for the next topic.
All right, thank you. I'm going to, is it possible for me to grab the screen?
Absolutely.
Okay, fantastic. Let's see. Sorry. Okay, there we go. Sorry, I was having some difficulty. Another small change to Zoom. How much I just love waking up and finding that to be true. Welcome everyone. Thank you. It's great to meet with you again in regards to NEMSIS and progress that we're making in the idea of trying to limit the use of several ANSI approved standards that are present in NEMSIS. ICD-10, RX norm, SNOMED CT, trying to limit their and focus the use of those codes. We've talked about this over the last two calls. We continue to make good progress here, trying to decide on what is the best approach to implementing some process that kind of ensures that we can begin to narrow down the breadth with which some of our providers are utilizing those codes to increase accuracy and to increase comparability. So both reliability and validity are kind of in question here. So we continue to investigate kind of the extent of those two issues, right? Are codes valid? Are they able to utilize the correct code for the correct symptom and impression, or is there fatigue, going on, too many codes, choosing one every time there's pain, something like that. We continue to look at that. And then also the idea of consistency, right? Do we really need, 12 codes for naloxone administration? So we continue to do that investigation, but I think we're honing down on an approach that will help us to tighten this up. And I want to talk about this a little bit more today, just for a couple minutes, and continue to gather comments from both the states and vendors regarding our most current thinking on this, as we hopefully develop kind of some formal processes here moving forward. So I'll just move through this pieces of this slide set that we've looked at over the last two calls, and just some minor modifications that have been made that I represent our current thinking. So there were a number of elements that rely on these patterns. For the elements you see on your screen now, there's really no defined list or expected to be any suggested or defined list, because really any possible RX norm code for medications or ICD-10 code for a cause of injury is possible. So no work happens here. For those lists that are utilized for symptoms and impressions, cause of injury, incident location type, and patient acuity, this is where there's kind of been a major kind of decision made, a draft decision made here. We talked last call 2 weeks ago about the idea of expecting these defined lists to be present in 3.5 products, with the idea that there would be general use schematron rules that could be used to ensure their use. And if you had one of those rare calls that required a symptom or impression outside of the what we think is the 90% of codes that are captured in the defined list, then it would throw a warning to the provider. There was some kickback to that, and we also went back and tried to look and see whether we could develop some schematron approach that would be better or more efficient. We've decided to back away from that and to really instead implement during the 3.5.0 compliance testing process, having some type of a subjective evaluation of the graphical interface in regards to the presentation of these elements. What that will look like, I'd like to talk about at the end of this discussion. That is how we would be assessing that. How do we make sure that if you've done some great work to make good use of AI or something that really improves their ability to search these lists, how would we evaluate that as compliant? We'll talk about it in just a minute. But the major focus here, I think I just wanted to throw out there, is we've walked away from the idea of relying on schematron rules to ensure the presence of these defined lists for these elements. We do expect a defined list to be present for 911 initiated ground transports with traditional providers responding. Specialty care is not required to, will be required to utilize the same lists for these. I apologize. So they'll, air medical, in-facility transport, critical care, they will rely on the same structure, the same graphical interface. They'll still be able to, providers of all kinds will still be able to use values outside of the defined lists. There'll be a standardized roll-up that Josh is working on and provides more information on that today. And then we also talked about the idea of providing a more standardized format for those lists that's more easily implementable by the vendors. That will also occur. So that's the current thinking in regards to these lists. So let me just, yeah, please, is there a comment?
Yeah, this is Samantha with ESM. Just a question about
Sorry, having a really hard time understanding your comment. Can you get closer to the microphone or?
Sorry, Clay, I'll put it in the chat.
Oh, you sound much better now.
Okay.
Yeah, you sound much better.
So this is Samantha with ESO. My question is around compliance testing. If like we have our symptoms list that has all the defined list values and a couple of other values for our specialty care patients, would that be an issue in compliance testing?
Yeah, that's a great question, and that's kind of that subjective parameters we've got to provide around this kind of an idea. If we're testing for this in compliance testing, how do we frame that up? Can there be other values associated with that? How how can specialty care be presented? So I'm gonna leave it open for just a minute, Samantha, to the idea that yes, there'll be some wiggle room there. How we define that, we'll talk about that in just a minute, Samantha, but that's a great question.
Great, thanks.
Yep, thank you. Okay, I'm going to just really quickly talk about procedures and medications, because that's the other set of elements that rely on these lists that we are expecting a little bit of a different approach to be taken here. Because, so again, there is a defined list of medications and procedures that are associated with a 911 ground activated call for all certification levels. And that's actually, there's a place for those lists within the state data set for states to complete. Now that with 3.5, since the state data set will be part of compliance testing, because it'll be part of the standard, we will have the ability to look at all those lists during compliance testing, ensure that they're there. If they should be there, the bulk of states do set parameters around procedures and medications for their providers. So we'll look for it to be there, and then we'll expect there to be state level demographic and EPCR schematron rules that are associated with the proper use of those elements. That has really been kind of one of the foreseeable value of the state data set was to provide some mechanism to assure that the right certification level is using the right medications and performing the correct procedures. So those will be a little bit different in that there will be an expectation that that defined list is in the state data set, and that there are state schematron rules associated with those. Here is where the medications and procedure list, this defined list, will not be required for specialty care. Their lists are much broader. If a state chooses to develop a list for specialty care, for some type of specialty care, that can certainly be provided. Again, values that fall outside of the defined list will still be possible. The existing patterns will still be allowed for these elements for all providers. Standardized roll-up for these is also being worked on by Josh. We'll talk more about that, and we'll provide these lists in a more standardized format based on our discussion over the last two calls. So this one is these will be a little bit of a tighter kind of representation of their presence, just because we'll have the state data set. We'll be going through the compliance process as well. So these ideas I realize are still a little bit at a high level, right? So we need to define what each of these things will look like in our compliance documentation, and we'll talk about that in just a minute. Samantha asked a great or a great question related to that topic, but I'll stop there and just see if there's any angst among states or vendors in regards to that, what we've kind of landed on as the approach.
We're still wondering about the whether the list that you have has been validated with your medical professionals, and also still, you're changing the compliance process at this point in time seems kind of silly. Those are kind of our takes on it.
Yeah, thank you, David. So let's take both of those in order. So the lists, it's a great thought. The lists, of course, have been developed over many years with many experts, and then were re-evaluated just this last year, 2019, looking at the 2018 data and ensuring that 90% of the values associated with any element could be captured with the values on the list. So
Right. I understand that. The kind of the flip side of that is, what's in that last 10%, some of them will probably be, absurd, useless codes. But some of them will be, codes that, are not that if you need it, you need it.
yes.
And just because it's part of 10%, to discard it for that reason alone kind of gives me pause.
Yeah, no, David, it's a great question. Let's flesh this out a little bit. It's a great question. The reason why we didn't try to capture 99%, you're right. There's the struck by duck, there's the accident with spacecraft. Those codes are in there, and we're probably just fat fingered, right? But so how do you capture that relating 10% that are truly valid? The reason why we didn't try to capture like 98% of codes was because the use of codes dropped off, right? It's called scree in statistics. There's codes that are used a lot, and then there's this long tail of codes that are just rarely ever used. And if our list, our list of, I think, causes of injury is now at 80 codes. If we tried to include the 95%, the 99%, it would have jumped up to like 180 codes, right? So we had,
that methodology is highly data centric, and I'm kind of talking about a different methodology.
Okay.
Which is, of those, so we got the bulk of the codes. That screed it just fine. Now, what's left, and is there anything in there that is medically important? I think is kind of where I'm coming from. So it's a different methodology than just raw code generation. It's more medical focus. That here is a code that is important. It's if this happens, you need to have the code in there. Something like that.
Yeah, I see what you're saying, David. So maybe what you're kind of suggesting here is having providers look at each list and say what's missing, right?
Right. So if some of those discarded codes, I understand that there's a lot of them, and many of them may very well be garbage and not needed. Or if you have some kind of analysis where you say, these 500 codes would roll up into this code that we did accept, that would be reassuring.
Okay.
So part tying into that, your roll up project as well. And so what doesn't roll up. So now you have a few hundred maybe of that you could a person could look at a list of this size, hopefully, fingers crossed, and say, this code maybe just, if you need it, you need it. Not because it happens a lot, but because if you need it, you need it.
Clay, this is Eric. We have a federal EMS operational group that has a couple docs that have some people that are on loan to them right now. I think they could do this work pretty quickly. We took a look at the list and eliminated the ones that we said just were absolutely absurd, and then gave them the ones that, hey, look, are these medically important? Should we, keep these in the list? I think they would do that in pretty quick order for us.
Yeah, great. That sounds wonderful. Yeah, so the initial list was developed, and we had a clinician go through them. But I agree. If we could have some other subject matter experts take a look at this and see if there's some codes that were left out that could be valuable. So
this is Frank at R1. I'd like to look through the remaining 10% as well. I think that the statistical approach is very accurate, except for the few cases where it only happened twice so far in an ambulance, but it's still valid. a valid procedure or something, you know, like that could happen. So we'd like to review those too.
That's great.
And just so I understand, Clay, it was a valid procedure as Frank just said, but it was also a valid procedure that didn't fit in something that was rolled up so that the provider didn't have to get to the 5th level of degree to get to that procedure, correct?
Yeah, no, let me be really, really accurate here. So this is really not the procedures. It's really the ones you see on the list now, symptoms, impressions.
I'm sorry, symptoms, but same basic philosophy. It didn't fit in something above. In other words, what is the depth of the provider expected to look at before they get to a definitive answer, I guess is how I'm trying to say it.
Right. So some of it, yeah, so you're right, Eric. Some of what was left as scree were just, and we're not included, we're just like total extensions out, you know, of the use of that code to maybe even include the alpha code at the end, right? Is this an initial visit, or, you know, or a secondary visit? Those were removed, right? So you're right about that. Maybe the code extension down so low was not necessary. That could be a reason. Another reason was that it's just a rare event. Surfboards do catch on fire, right? And there is a code for that, right? So maybe, and that could have been valid once or twice, right? Those kind of codes aren't in there, aren't in the list now because they weren't, their frequency of use wasn't represented in 90% of calls in 2018. So there's kind of
Clay, this is Ben at Image Trend, and I think, you know, we talked about this, and I think listening to David and Frank, and also from the last call, I think one thing that's important, you've got it in the slides here, but I think in the conversation, the dialogue, it's easy for folks that we're breaking down this distinction between meds and procedures versus the slide you've got up right now for, you know, symptoms, impressions, cause of injury, et cetera, right? And with meds and procedures for the 911 ground response, you know, that the suggested list you have now, those are actually pretty comprehensive, you know, and the exceptions to that normally are going to be either state specific, which you intend to handle through, you know, the state data sets in 3.5, or through, you know, specialty care and them having, you know, a different list or in addition to. But these symptoms and impressions, you know, these are the ones that I think are that bigger opportunity for values that are, you know, could be a scree, could be, you know, that unique instance. And I think these are the ones that, you know, there is a lot of opportunity for feedback and review. I mean, if you're thinking about, say, interfacility, these folks are getting, you know, definitive diagnoses from facilities, and that's where you're probably going to get a lot of legitimate and correct values that are, you know, quite out there. Those would be specialty, you know, but I know it's in listening to some of the feedback, I think there's, you know, it's easy for us to be blending meds, procedures, and then this list here, which are more, you know, injury and symptoms, impressions.
Yeah, Ben, good point. Yeah, thank you for refocusing us.
Hey, Clay, I got asked a question about the 90%. How did you guys validate that these lists actually contain the 90% versus not a lower number? What is there a way, or do you guys have your steps that you guys went into somewhere that we can refer this to people? 90% is a pretty high number, and I think people are concerned about, does it actually contain 90%, or is this a guess?
Oh, okay. Yeah, and that was brought up last week, so thank you for the reminder, is for us to document the methodology that we utilized. What we basically did was look at the current suggested lists. We looked at all the values that were provided in 2018. So there were like 2,100 causes of injury, for example, and we went through and then made sure we had frequency counts for the use of those codes. And then we made sure that the revision of the suggested list included 90% of those codes in the 2018 data set based on frequency. And then there was a clinical review after that as well to make sure that there wasn't just some people were utilizing pain all the time. So there was a scree of important pain codes that were not included in the 90%. So that was also included. But we'll come up with a methodology statement. I think that's valuable. We can provide a list of the codes that weren't included. So what we're calling kind of the scree, and so folks can look at that. And then I really like this idea of an expert panel just reviewing that the lists look good. I think with all of this, though, we can feel pretty confident that the lists that are now available are pretty solid, right? So again, we still want to have the ability to change these lists. There's going to be new ICD-10 codes coming around. Those are available several times a year, so we want to have the ability to modify these defined lists based on things that we find as an industry that need to be added or subtracted or changed. So we'll still want to be able to do that.
Hey Clay, this is Juan. Just make sure I understand that what you're saying is that essentially we're going to have standard lists that people submit, but if we do have specialty care or something outside the norm, they can still send that information in without having to create custom elements at the state level?
Right, Juan. So let me unpack that again. This relates to Ben's comment very well. So what you see here on the screen now, whatever our defined lists are, these are expected to be used by both specialty care and by primary 911 initiated care. They will always have the ability to use the existing patterns that are available for these elements, so they can step outside of the defined list. The vendors can make a way for the providers to step outside of this list to handle that 10% or of codes that aren't included in the defined list. Did that answer your question, Juan?
Well, I mean, if they step out, is the requirement to create custom elements, or are they going to be able to submit through the same element now? So this way we're not creating custom elements.
Right, they can submit through the mechanism as it is now. Right now, any code within the existing patterns that exist for these elements can be submitted. That will still be true. There'll be a roll up, yeah, yep.
And then us as a state would roll it up to you guys, so this way you don't get that clause.
Right, it would be rolled up to a category that probably exists within the 90%. You can use that roll up. We're going to use that roll up. Josh is preparing those, so it'll be standardized across the country. We'd love to have them roll up the same way in every state. So we hope that every state will take advantage of our roll ups and utilize them.
This is Josh, but I think the value itself would be passed through by the state to the national database unchanged. The roll-ups would be used in analytical tools.
True. Okay. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, thanks, Josh. Yes. Yeah, thank you. That's correct.
And Clay, there's a couple of comments in the group chat. Jim Madison was just bringing up that they get far more complaints or observations that the lists are too long versus that a value is missing. So that's valuable feedback, Jim. Thank you for that.
Great. Yeah, thank you, Jim. Okay, good. Great comments. I'm just going to, in the interest of time, just step onto the next little piece that kind of Samantha introduced. If there are other comments about this, I'd love to circle back. The idea here is that for these elements, if we're going to be, quote, evaluating the presence of these defined lists during compliance testing, that's pretty subjective, right? And we've got to come up with some kind of parameters around what we expect to see. We try not to use this approach in compliance testing as we try to use it as little as possible. because we just want to objectively test for the presence of the standard. But here we're thinking this is the best approach. So we want to define these parameters and make those changes to the compliance document. One request we had is for the vendor community, we would love to have the opportunity to be on a Zoom call with your primary product, your EPCR product, for us to watch and see how a provider would complete each of these elements you can see on your screen. We'd like to just see what kind of variability is available across the industry in regards to how vendors are facilitating the use of these elements. So we're going to request if you could contact us, and we'll reach out to you as well. If you could provide a time where you would feel comfortable with us looking at that. We're not looking to evaluate one versus another. We won't be sharing the approach of one software product compared to another. All we're trying to do is try to collect information that would best inform us as to what you'll see in a compliance document regarding this topic. Does that seem doable?
Clay, this kind of feels like the first step towards NEMSIS attempting to dictate how we present data to the end user. Can you speak to that assumption?
Yeah, I can, and I appreciate that comment, Keenan. There have been calls for us to take that kind of an approach in compliance testing for years, right? To ensure that things work well, or what's not a good interface versus what is a good interface. How are custom elements being presented in one product versus another? And we've always stepped away from that, and we will continue to step away from that. This is Keenan, you're absolutely right. This does kind of step away from what has been a mantra for over a decade. But we recognize that, and that has been a strong kind of underlying premise of our compliance testing since the beginning. So I think even though this may be happening, I'm hoping, and we'll bring it to this group, that when you actually see that the documentation, once we've evaluated it, that it is as objective as possible, and that it's not a scoring system. It won't be something like, evaluating one versus another, or dictating how you show the data. We'll be careful not to do that. We're looking only to ensure that that the defined lists are available. So Keenan, your point is very well taken. Keep that in mind as we develop the language here, and let's ensure that we're not stepping on slippery ground.
And this is Josh, if I might chime in on that as well. The thought process that we're going through is, hey, we could say these suggested lists need to show up in your software, and during compliance testing, you need to show Laurel the drop-down list, say for symptoms, and she's going to make sure that the 100 and some symptoms are actually what's on your list. But that actually would start to dictate your UI. So what we're trying to figure out is, how do we put together a compliance requirement that tests that you are implementing a reasonable set of values for these lists that comes from the suggested lists, but doesn't lock you in too far, and doesn't lock you in terms of how you present that. And so the variability we've thought about hypothetically is, what if a vendor is doing some great parsing of the narrative and is proposing to the provider what they might choose for symptoms based on what they wrote in their narrative? Some natural language processing. Well, we wouldn't want to hold you up on compliance because you did that. Or you're using some AI to look at all the data throughout the report and to float some values up to the top of the list for the provider to pick because they seem like what's going to be useful, or you're tracking recent trends in the community and seeing an uptick of something, and so you're starting to float those values to the top of the list. All kinds of different creative approaches that vendors could use to help providers fill out these elements. So we've got to come up with a compliance testing requirement that actually stays out of the way of how you present the UI. And so the thought here is, if the NEMSIS TAC team can see a sampling of UIs, then that may help them to better craft the compliance requirements in such a way that it does not get in the way of those different creative approaches.
Josh, that was well put. Thank you. I really, that's kind of what I was insinuating. That to me speaks in a contradiction to the first item on the right side of the screen here.
Yeah, the idea of having the hierarchy structure.
Correct.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, good point. Yeah, good point. And we'll be working also to ensure that this PowerPoint presentation is based on our final decisions, and so this can be used for some educational purposes. So that's why we continue to work off of this. But thank you, Keenan. So great comments, really great comments. I'm just going to really quickly respond to Doug Butler from Image Trend. He also included a message in the chat. We talked about provider fatigue, about the long list, but are we shifting to provider frustration that would occur because they're missing 10% of codes for medical events? And then additionally, should we get feedback related to billing and revenue collection? So yeah, Doug, we have thought about both of those two things. I think because they're not locked into the defined list, they can still continue to use patterns. Hopefully the products facilitate the use for that 10%. We don't want to create frustration because those are missing. I mean, that's 1 out of 10 calls, right? And then also in regards to billing and revenue collection, we looked into that as much as we possibly could, and we just, there remains no code set for EMS billing. So we're pretty confident that the 90% of codes and then the ability to just use the existing pattern for the 10% should still provide the same ability to correctly code. It's just they won't be looking for, hopefully, 10 different codes for the fact that naloxone was administered. So you're right. I mean, we need to continue to think about all those things, but when a builder has to look at 2,100 causes of injury, and of course the builder doesn't look at cause of injury, but still, I think if we can get that list down to 80 or 100 and have it be accurate, this seems like that would be so much less frustrating for everyone. So,
yeah, that's Frank. I agree completely. It would be. I think the piece that's missing is just seeing the codes that are excluded when we look through them all and see that all the different types of dolphin attack subsequent injuries are what's in there, and maybe we find 3 that we need to add or something. I think that helps a lot. But.
Yeah, that would help, and we'll make that scree list available.
And Clay, this is kind of a question for maybe the other vendors. Is what I feel like is going to happen is we'll go with this set of this defined list. Our customers will basically give us feedback that, hey, you know, these things are consistently missing, and 1 out of 10 doesn't seem like a lot until you're running 20 runs in a 24-hour period and you want to throw your computer out the window. So we're going to get a bunch of feedback from our customers, and then every vendor is going to have the defined list plus the other 40 that were missed, right?
Keenan, this is Ben at Image Trend, and we had some conversations about this when it was presented a month ago, and I think on our end, without saying definitively, I think our plan really is to continue to use the resources, right? I mean, you know, when they talk about the schema, you know, still using the same pattern, you know, those patterns are going to come, you know, we don't plan on having to create an additional step for us to recreate or, you know, come up with our own, you know, pattern constraints that allow us to submit those values. So if, you know, we can still use, you know, ICD-10 and allow my specialty care folks to pick that, you know, dolphin attack. And it's going to roll up to, you know, that higher level category, you know, that either the state or, you know, NEMSIS wants. Then I think on our end, that is our intent. I hear your concern or idea that if we limit this, are the agencies then going to turn around and come back and say, well, I want that other option that, you know, isn't in this list. And we look back and say, well, we had that 2 years ago. You know, and I think that's also where that kind of, you know, my comment earlier, that's where we get into this nuance about the distinction in meds and procedures versus, you know, the list he's got here is, you know, I think with specialty care, with your, you know, critical care, your interfacilities, they're going to want those additional meds, right? That they're hanging on infusion that 911 doesn't have. But by and large, you know, 95% of my clients are going to have what they want from even the suggested list. The primary symptoms impressions are the ones I think we get the most complaints about internally at Image Trend is, oh, why does my impression list have, you know, 400 options? You know, there's only about 150 things I really want to document. So I don't think we plan on, unless, you know, the tech requirement or compliance forces us to leave the resource that underpins where we're getting that list from now. I think we just plan to implement people with the, you know, the defined list, and then, you know, caution them when you want to go above and beyond that. You know, there are more, and here's the resource, and, you know, it'd be the same process for us, but just realize it's going to map, it's going to roll, you know, map to a value that the state accepts.
Yeah, Ken, I think the idea would be too that we would review these defined lists on a regular basis. We'd have to work on how we can communicate with you folks about commonly requested additions to be present during in the graphical interface to ensure we're adding those. And then we'll probably also be looking at new addition to the code lists as well. So that'll become a regular process that we will do as an industry. But yeah, we'll have to work on that, because you and Ben are right? You guys receive these one-off requests all the time, I'm sure, and whether that's one that needs to be in the national defined list, or whether that's just this specific area or this specific agency, we'll have to work on that. But the idea of refining these lists and making them better, more efficient, that's the underlying idea that I want to make sure folks recognize, that these aren't static. We'll continue to refine them.
Yeah, I think we're all going to have, it seems like we're all going to have an approach to allow our customers to do what best meets their needs, which also sort of leads me back to, well, did we even need to do any of this anyway? That's really where I sit.
Yeah, I think the pendulum has swung way too far to the one end. So I think the roll-ups, the standardized usable lists, I think this plan will still provide some value, I'm thinking.
This is Josh. Keenan, are you thinking along the lines of, hey, we fix this now, we get it down to like 100 codes, then people add the onesies, twosies that they need, and 5 years from now we're having the same conversation again, trying to figure out how we got back up to 2,000 codes?
Yeah, that's functionally what it is. We're going to ship the product with whatever the defined list is, and or try to restrict to it, but we're also going to allow customers to go outside of that, right? You've said, hey, we can use values as long as they meet the pattern. And when they say, hey, my guys need this thing, we're going to allow them to use this thing. And like you said, Josh, I don't even think it's going to be 5 years. Next year, we're going to be talking about this. Year after next, we're going to be talking about this.
And do you see that as a
If we tried to
problem?
standardize that, sorry, Peter from Zoll here. If we tried to standardize that and do some sort of roll up, you're going to end up with a kind of drift where the intention of the codes slowly moves away from what people are selecting them for, because they're going to start assigning value to things that don't actually exist, or things that are not necessarily part of the original intention.
Yeah, so again, I think this is a work in progress, right? I'm hesitant to just stall this and say that this won't work because of what ifs, but I clearly recognize that there are important what ifs, right? So the value we have here is that we work together as an industry, and that as we roll this out, if we find that there's some piece of this that isn't working, and we can together think of a way to improve it, then we'll improve it. I think this is a first good step that we've come up with, these multiple conversations to move us forward, unless someone feels like really we need to abandon this and stick with what we've got. Okay, well, this has been a great conversation. Please feel free through the remainder of this call or to contact me, Julianne, anyone on the team, Laurel on the team. We'd love to hear your comments. We have some products that we need to get to you that I think will help you and inform your opinions and your decisions as you, for example, take a look at the codes that weren't included. We'll run this through an expert panel. We'll develop a methodology. We'll talk about what structure you want the codes to be in to have them best consumable. And we're going to talk about the roll-ups here in just a moment, that Josh has kind of drafted a document that he wants to pass off to you to take a look at. So thank you. Really, this type of conversation is really what has made NEMSIS successful since the beginning, right? Really bouncing off ideas, being critical about what might or might not work. So thank you for the comments. I'll pass it back to you, Julian, just for now. And if we want to circle back to this, I'm happy to do that.
All right, thank you, Clay. Josh, you are up next. Do you want to share your screen, or do you want me to put the agenda back up?
Yeah, I'll go ahead and share my screen. Here it comes. Should see the PDF.
Yep, looks good.
All right. Okay, so last month on a V3 implementation call, I shared a PowerPoint presentation with some slides giving you kind of an overview of how the NEMSIS TAC will be implementing some analytical roll-ups off of 3 external standards: the ICD-10 CM diagnosis set, the RX norm medications, and the SNOMED CT procedures. And it was requested to release a document that contains the kind of the business requirements for what we're going to be doing. So we had a NEMSIS TAC internal document, and we generalized that, kind of took out the things that were just specific to tables in the NEMSIS warehouse and that kind of stuff, and have prepared this generalized document for sharing with stakeholders. It's not quite on the website yet, but will be soon. And you'll see in this document that it covers some stuff, you know, the slides that I shared on the previous call, you'll recognize that I pulled those slides from this document. So what you'll get when you see this document is for each of the code sets, for example, here's the ICD-10 CM diagnosis code set. I've listed the data source, the authoritative data source for that code set, how frequently it's updated, where the website is that announces those releases, where the documentation is for the file formats, and then a link or link pattern to the source file that I recommend grabbing for that data set. So for ICD-10 CM, there's an FTP site, and it has this URL pattern to it, where you got to substitute in a year, and you'll get the file. Gets the file in an XML format. Then I've explained the hierarchy that we're going to implement with ICD-10. We're going to start at the chapter level, and section, category, 3 subcategories, and finally the exact diagnosis code. The diagnosis code is the code that would be in a NEMSIS data element. I've suggested a table layout for an analytical table, so a denormalized table that would implement that hierarchy. And I have identified the XPath notation, or XPath for figuring out what goes into each of those columns in the table. So parsing through the XML document, you use these XPath notations to essentially populate a database table or data warehouse table that would have all of the ICD-10 diagnosis codes with those roll-ups through the hierarchy. There are some additional technical details about the ICD-10 CM XML file and how you got to do a little bit of additional work to get what's called the 7th character in some codes and tack those on to descriptions. And so a few additional details like that to cover. The idea here is that first, I will say this is a fairly technical document. We didn't spend a lot of time kind of making it non-tech friendly. So this really is, this is like you hand this to your data warehouse developers and not necessarily to an EMS agency administrator. But this would allow all of you as software vendors to, you could implement this ICD-10 hierarchical rollup anytime using the specifications in this document. The NEMSIS TAC does intend to finish the implementation in the national database and then provide a mechanism by which you could download essentially this table where the NEMSIS TAC has already done all the parsing. But you don't need to wait for that. If you've got some developers who want to move ahead and build this in your analytical tool sets, you could do it today. You've got all the information here. RX norm, same thing. We've got the list to the release site, the documentation, the source files, how you could script the downloads, a table layout for a data warehouse table. And then what we're going to propose in RX norm is that let me get back up to the data warehouse table. Our roll-up is really going to be this column right here, medication code ingredients. So no matter what the medication code was and that description, we're going to map back to what the ingredients are. So the NEMSIS suggested lists really focus on ingredient codes. But we know that people may submit a brand name or a drug pack code or whatever, clinical dose form. Well, all of those contain ingredients. And the RX norm standard has a relationships table that connects all of those different codes back to an ingredient. And so this is the mapping paths that will be implemented. If the code is a brand name code, the relationships table contains a mapping from that brand name using the trade name of relationship, and it gets to a multiple ingredient or ingredient code. If it's a brand name pack code type, then it has a relationship mapping using the keyword contains that maps to a SCD, which is semantic clinical drug. And from semantic clinical drug, we can use the has ingredient relationship to map to a brand name. And finally, from a brand name, we can use the trade name of relationship to map to a multiple ingredient or single ingredient code. So these are all the different term types that are in RX norm and the mapping path for each of those types to get us to that multiple ingredient or ingredient roll-up. So that's how we're going to do that roll-up. Finally, for SNOMED, same thing. We've got the source files and documentation there. And in SNOMED, we're not implementing a roll-up at this time, but I do explain the semantic tags. The semantic tags in SNOMED are just part of the term text. They don't have their own, they're not their own attribute in SNOMED. It's kind of messy. And so that semantic tag, for clarity, for cleanness, it's helpful to just pull that semantic tag off and stick it into its own data warehouse column so that it could be analyzed separately. So this explains that. In NEMSIS, we really only use procedures and regime therapy codes. We don't use most of these other semantic tags, but they are present in the original source, so it's important to account for them. So that's the SNOMED piece. So this will go up on the website. Again, it was an internal technical document that has been generalized for all of you to look at, but not from the perspective of this is what we would hand to end users. This is sort of for work that you might do under the hood in your systems. That's what we've got so far on that. Any questions or comments?
Hey Josh, Amber in Colorado. Just a quick question. Do you plan, and I know we've talked about this, but I just want to make sure, are you planning to roll up all of the ICD-10 codes or only those that are in the defined list?
The roll-up will cover everything.
And then is there a way, I just want to continue to emphasize the benefit of the state getting the original code, even if it wasn't a part of the defined list? I know this question strays outside of this document, but is there a way to ensure that we at the state will get the code that the provider submitted, even if it fell outside of the defined list? Say if a vendor would like to map an unacceptable code to an acceptable code so their provider doesn't get that annoying warning. Is there any way that we can ensure that no matter what, we still get maybe the more detailed code at the state level? Because we tend to use that a lot for our research as well.
Yes, the updated proposal that Clay shared this morning takes off of the table the idea of having national schematron rules that would block sending codes that are not on the suggested list. A local agency would, the idea right now is the software products would come kind of off the shelf with the suggested lists implemented in them, but the local EMS agency may turn on and off some of those codes. They may tweak the lists for local purposes. The current proposal is that you would receive exactly the code that the agency recorded. These roll-ups would be in analytical tools, so they would not affect the actual transactional data going between systems.
Okay, so the idea would be that the state would implement the same roll-up that you're implementing and potentially a state vendor?
Yeah, right.
That was my nice hint to some of the state.
Right, the idea being when you go into the analytical reporting tool that your vendor provides, that today you may see that you're able to take primary impression and stick it into your analytical report, and you get the very detailed primary impression codes, and then you get your count of patient care reports or your average scene time or whatever you were trying to analyze. And the idea is that in the future, if your vendor implements these roll-ups, then for ICD-10, you've got a hierarchy. You would actually be able to drill down. And so you'd be able to start at the chapter level if you wanted, and then drill down to the section level and so on. So you could decide the level of depth you want to go depending on the end purpose of your analysis. If you're putting out just a public document about the types of calls that EMS went on last year, you're going to keep it fairly high level. And then when you're doing some very specific analysis for pediatric asthma, you're going to get detailed and get right down to the granular level. Comment from Elizabeth that ICD-10 gets implemented on October 1st of each year. Oops, to ICD-10 here. Yeah, that's an annual update. They typically produce the files between June and August. for an October 1st implementation date. And Arash asked about the URL to the PDF. It's not quite on the website yet.
Yeah,
Okay,
Josh,
great.
on the website, and then we'll roll out that link in the Google group.
Okay, Julianne, back to you.
All right, thank you, Josh. Any other questions for Josh? All right. Next up on the agenda, Clay's going to talk for just a minute about legal brief.
Yeah, thank you. I'll be very brief here. Thank you for everybody holding on. We do plan this to be 90 minutes, but we often go 60. It looks like we're going to go over a little today, and that's great. We've had some great conversation. Just wanted to let folks know that NHTSA asked us to contract with a legal firm to develop some documents that will help us to try to facilitate in the future the bidirectional flow of EMS data. So this continues to be a difficult task for states, for agencies, for vendors, even for health information exchanges, just because of the lack of understanding and known protections that are in place for hospitals and for others that are reluctant to share data. So we have been working with Page, Wolfberg, and Wirth to actually develop a couple of products that will, I think, help you and that you could distribute, that could help those folks who are hesitant in regards to sharing information. These tools should help. Wanted to show you the draft of the larger, more kind of colorful and more informative tool. It's about a 20-page document that walks through all of the attributes of HIPAA and other rules that have been put into place that really indicate that their main purpose is actually to facilitate the exchange of data. One of the valuable things of this document is it's very informative, it's very colorful. This is something that you could pass off to hospital administrators and to others to help them understand the topic. It's still pretty focused. It's also valuable in that it really includes right up-to-date information, including some of the decisions that have been made in regards to data exchange that happened this spring. So it's very up to date, and I think will be very valuable for you as you try to work with folks and try to ensure a data exchange. We're kind of in the final phases of completing this document. There's a number of small edits and picture edits that we're making, but we're very close to releasing this, so wanted to let you just know that this is out there. We also plan to have Page, Wolfberg, and Wirth, they're working on it now actually, to have a true legal opinion that's produced, very similar to the one that they produced in 2007, just a 2-page document that's really legalese that you could pass off to legal representatives of hospitals and others that just speaks to the actual laws that are in place. So it's kind of a lawyer to lawyer kind of document that will also be rolling out probably close to the same time as this document. So just wanted to let you know that this is coming out, and I just checked to see if there's any questions about this document. Okay, good. I think it should be incredibly helpful. So we'll let you know as soon as those are available through the Google group.
All right, thank you, Clay. Real quick, I'm going to talk for just a minute about the annual V3 implementation meeting and boot camp. The boot camp flyer's gone out. We've had lots of great response on the registration. That is August 25th, 9 a.m. to 1 p.m. The boot camp is specific to state level partners. We're going to review state access, state tools, and it is not open to vendors, but we are thrilled with your interest and participation. We've had really good response to that. So we will send that flyer out again, just so you have an opportunity to register for that. And this will cover a lot of the basics for state implementation, state tools, state access in this boot camp. It was really well received last year. We had great feedback and are excited to be able to provide this again for state data managers and the people who are involved in that state level. Also, with the annual V3 implementation meeting, we had a really terrific response to the survey that we sent out. Thank you so much for your input, your suggestions. We have adjusted the delivery for the annual V3 meeting to be 3 days instead of 1, and we'll do it 9 a.m. to 1 p.m. Mountain Time, September 15th, 16th, and 17th. So it'll be 3 days of a 4-hour sessions, and we will push out the agenda ahead of time so that you can make plans in your schedules so that you can be prepared for those discussions. We had a lot of great suggestions on the issues and topics that would be really pertinent and important to address in our annual V3 meeting. So we really appreciate your input on that. Are there any questions for the boot camp and the V3 meeting? Oh, we don't have registration up yet for the V3 meeting, but that will be coming soon. Let me go ahead and share my screen for the website. I'm going to show you the updated timeline for the next item on the agenda. So as always, when you go to the NEMSIS.org website, you can find the V3-5 release timeline. And I just want to share that we've made an adjustment here to when the NEMSIS TAC is prepared to accept 3.5 data, and that will be in September of this year. Compliance is already open. We already have at least one vendor that has started that compliance process for V3.5, but we will be prepared to start accepting the data in September of this year. Any questions on V3.5 data acceptance? There's also the other timelines that are available on the website that just show different attributes of the versioning. All right. You can always contact us, reach out with any questions or concerns, either about the boot camp, annual meeting, timeline, anything that's on your mind. We're happy to have those conversations. Next, we've got items from the Office of EMS. Unfortunately, Eric had to drop off of our call to take another call. Clay, do you want to talk about some of these topics?
Sure, I can just touch on them briefly.
Okay, thanks.
You bet. In this call, a couple of calls ago, Eric talked to us about the idea of how we might be able to collect information regarding agencies that are having difficulty obtaining PPE. We decided as a group, as an industry, to not include that as part of NEMSIS in either the DAM or the EPCR file, but they have just a freestanding form that sits on a website where an agency could go and provide that information. So that's underway. There's a red cap tool that's being used to develop a single page PPE data collection that will reside on the NEMSIS website. You'll have access to that URL to share in your graphical interface if you'd like to add that. And I think Eric will provide more information regarding that in the future. That's just high level. Eric's also been working with state software vendors, talking about how to collect burn rate of PPE in a form that would be different from the data collection regarding your need for it. So he continues to work with a number of vendors related to that. Then I think the last item there was just the ILI data sharing agreement. That agreement only lasts through the last day of July. There are 40 states that have allowed their state level and county level geographic distributions of influenza-like illness rates to be shared with federal indices and with other states, so they could see what was going on in their borders. He'll want to renew that, I'm sure, just with the current what's going on with COVID right now. It's used by about 40 people at any given time. Some states, Arizona, Minnesota, some states use that dashboard a lot. Lots of federal agencies utilize it. So that's been incredibly valuable, and I think has been a good step towards understanding the idea that NEMSIS could perhaps release surveillance type information at the state and county level and have that be valuable. So I think those are the three areas that he wanted to just touch on and just to bring you up to date on. Thanks, Julianne. Good question for Ben. I'll just share, is there info on how Eric expects a burn rate to be calculated, how that would be evaluated? I'm not sure. I've only been involved in one of those phone calls. I know that he's had several. And so I'm not sure, Ben. I can ask Eric to get back to you and to let you know what he's thinking. Okay, thank you. Thanks, Julianne.
All right, are there any other questions or comments? We're happy to have those discussions. Any issues to be brought forth during open forum? So Elizabeth put a message on the chat. Has the TAC started to think about ICD 11? Gee, I couldn't even let the 11 out of my mouth. Implementation.
Yeah, no, we haven't given a lot of thought. We try to track with it and understand it, but we haven't given any thought to its implementation yet.
Thank you, Elizabeth, for the question.
Yes, Elizabeth notes that ICD-11 is radically different. It would be lots of new structures for us to develop. So we're watching.
So there's another question about if we would reconsider allowing vendors to listen in on the boot camp session, and as a new vendor, it could be very helpful to them understanding the state situation, their needs and use cases. So the boot camp really is very specific to states. There are very few instances where a state has requested that their vendor do all of their, facilitate all their state implementation. So there are very rare instances where a vendor has actually been requested by the state data manager to participate in the boot camp. It would have to be a very specific reason to open it up to vendors broadly and not exclude others for just that learning purpose. Clay, do you want to weigh in on that at all?
Yeah, the only other thing I would add is probably one of the primary reasons why we keep it with the state officials is that we spend a fair amount of time going into their state level data sets, right? They're using their state specific passwords and usernames to access the NEMSIS data, and then working through the process of utilizing it in helpful ways. And so we of course can't, our data use agreements don't allow that to be shared outside of the states. And so that's another good reason why we try to just keep it to state representatives. But the underlying thought is a good one.
Mm-hmm. We've got another question from Peter about some clarification on UUIDs, specifically what each category of UUID is hoping to retain in each group.
Yeah, that's a really good question, and maybe on the next call we can revisit. Maybe we can revisit UUIDs. Yeah, thank you for the suggestion.
Yeah, that's a good topic to come back up as an item on our agenda. Another question is the scheduling for the upcoming meetings. We actually hold our V3 implementation calls on the 2nd and 4th Wednesdays. And so occasionally there's a 3-week gap in there between meetings. So you'll see the dates reflected as 2nd and 4th Wednesdays of the month. Great questions. Thank you, everyone. So our next meeting is July 22nd, same time, same place. If you have any questions, comments, concerns, need to chat or visit about any of these issues, please feel free to reach out to any member of the TAC. We're happy to have those conversations with you, and we certainly appreciate your participation and your input. Thank you, everyone, for being with us today. We appreciate you taking time out of your busy schedules. And we will see you again in a couple of weeks. Thanks, everyone.